So thank you very much for everyone for coming to our session on intermunicipal planning through renewed collaboration. My name is Martin Frigo. I'll be the moderator for today. And I just will say a couple words about our session. So as we all know, working together intermunicipally really has its challenges, but there's also full of potentials. Collaboration is really about finding and building on our shared interests and values to create mutually, that's a big word, mutually beneficial outcomes. The importance of collaboration is renewed through the new Modernized Municipal Government Act's requirements for intermunicipal development plans, intermunicipal collaboration frameworks, and growth boards. Our session today, we will learn about, we'll be teaching about strategies to direct our projects towards mutually beneficial collaborative decision making. We'll also learn how to design our projects from the bottom up to obtain buy-in from our communities, stakeholders, and elected officials. So our presenters today are Lauren Bartlett with Maven Strategy Limited and Stephanie Gagnon with Maven Strategy as well. And I'll just turn it over to you to start our session.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Okay, so thanks everyone for coming. We're really excited to be here. Lauren and I are planners, strategists, and mediators, and we have just recently embarked upon Maven Strategy together because we very much love this type of work. We love collaboration, we love working with multiple parties to come to solutions. We also work alongside great partners, and so working with all kinds of organizations throughout Alberta to make sure that these intermunicipal development plans and ICFs and other kinds of collaborations come to successful fruition. So we're excited to be here. We tend to walk and talk, so we're going to be down here and not up there. Also, ever so slightly, because I have walked right off platforms before, and that's just not a good sign. So we'll be down here. We also really encourage this session to be about discussion and dialogue. So we're hoping that you will also participate with us to share your stories, share ideas. We're professionals who've been doing this for a long time, and a lot of what's in today's presentation will be about our experiences, also drawing on resources that we have come across through our teachings. We teach with AUMA as well as the University of Calgary, and so we're going to draw in some of that material, and then we want to talk with you about your experiences. So I'm going to just do a little introduction of myself, give you a sense of who I am. This work is very interpersonal, and you get who you get when you work with us, so you get us. I'm Steph Gagnon. I have been doing this for about 15 years, and I love planning work. I also have realized that I love strategy and I love multi-party processes. That came to be when I was a university student. So my very first experience, full-on consensus, 6 months of developing a conference for 100 students, high school students, where we came up with accommodation on sustainability, where we brought industry members, environmental organizations, and social organizations to the table. And I can tell you that we learned so much together about consensus, both sometimes around how you got to move it forward a little bit faster, and sometimes around finding the right spot for everybody in that process so they get what they want. So that's my experience in terms of who I am.
Does this work? This is a little bit much, eh? The Madonna mic. So just bear with me. I'm getting used to it. First off, before I even introduce myself, how are you guys doing? Good. Thank you. I was a little worried there for a moment. Last session, second day, you're all looking a little like, oh, and I'm so appreciative that you're here, so thank you. I'm Lauren. I am a planner, yes, but probably more aligned with high-level strategy. I love big process. I love process with people. And we're also focused on change management, so that's something that's a newer way of looking at evolution for communities and organizations. So that's something that's my latest thing. But probably most passionate, I am a conflict resolution specialist. And I work from a collaborative base. So I am a mediator. I use these skills every day, and I'll share a few with you today. But I also mediate with the courts to keep my skill set fresh, where it's 3 hours to pull everything out that you have. So.
Okay, so we're going to talk a lot about collaboration, and it does sometimes feel like that, but it doesn't have to. It can feel much less like a tug of war and much more like finding the right solutions and looking for possibilities. Planning is very often seen as a very technical or design or engagement activity, and there is a difference here. Intermunicipal planning, at its core, is largely a negotiation between many partners, many different stakeholders. So how is it different? For those of you who haven't necessarily been doing intermunicipal development planning or intermunicipal planning at all, it is quite different than, say, an area structure plan. In the case of an intermunicipal development plan, you have multiple councils. Even if it's just two, you have two councils, two administrations, stakeholders galore, all with different interests. And we're not going to say that necessarily those interests all align within one municipality. You need to be able to explore all of those different elements. It's also really high level. So intermunicipal development plans, we're still really, many of us on the ground are still understanding how that fits with an a municipal development plan. What's in scope? What's not in scope? That's a negotiation from the beginning. So is the plan area. What defines that shared boundary? How do you decide what's appropriate for every municipality? And so, for example, one of the things that project that we're working on is with 6 municipalities, and some of you are in the room. And so 6 municipalities resulting in 9 IDPs. And so we have the awareness that there are many stakeholders involved, and there are many different cultures, there's different history, there's different expectations. You have to take that into consideration, along with a healthy dose of respect for autonomy for every municipality. And so it is quite a different exercise than other types of land use planning. Okay, just a quick refresher. So first off, how many of you are currently involved in IDPs or intermunicipal collaboration frameworks? Okay, then I'm not going to go through a lot of detail. Okay, but high level, what has changed? So intermunicipal development plans have now become a requirement for municipalities across the province. You must have one with every one of your land-based neighbors. For many municipalities, you already had one in place. But for rural to rural municipalities, or for some of the very smaller municipalities to the rurals, they didn't necessarily. And so within the next 2 years, the task is to get the IDPs completed. On top of that, the ICF is brand new, and it addresses different things. So does the IDP. So it's no longer just land use and transportation utilities. Now we need to make sure that we're talking about environmental matters as a priority. We need to be addressing recreation and social programming, emergency services, as well as any other item, economic development perhaps, that is important to your council. And so they fit together. An ICF is much more about the financing and the cost sharing. It's about how do you service your existing residents and the ones that are going to be coming with future development. The intermunicipal development plan is all about future development for a certain area, but they fit together, and they need to fit together quite nicely. So I'm just going to talk, that gives you a quick overview of what they're meant to accomplish. So it's new, right? We've got to do all this stuff, and it's brand new. But collaboration isn't new in Alberta. In fact, Alberta has a really healthy history of great collaborations between municipalities. We have been doing collaborations for years. So for example, the Southern Alberta Emergency Management Resource Sharing Agreement, I think it is, started in 2007, had 44 municipalities signed on to a mutual aid agreement. We've got Evergreen Waste Management Services Commission that also has been used for a long time, making sure that the waste services in areas. The thing about what we've been doing so great over the last number of years is that we've been doing it around single services and making sure that we're cost sharing really effectively. Now, with the ICFs and the IDPs, municipalities that I've been talking with are starting to think about, okay, well, what about more complex things? What about not just looking at one piece of the puzzle at a time, but rather looking at them all together? So that brings us to collaboration. And really, we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on IDPs or ICFs specifically in this presentation. We're going to talk about how do you collaborate? What are the key elements? You can use it in this work. You can also use it in all kinds of other work. So collaboration, a situation where 2 or more people work together to create something in common towards a common goal. This is a core principle of the work that Lauren and I do. It's something we do every day. And from our perspective, the 2 points at the bottom there, super important. So it's a working practice. We practice at it every day. It is not something that we complete. It is not something that is done because it's different every time. And then the other piece of it is that we're always looking for solutions. No obvious answer emerges usually that everybody's ready to go jump onto. So making sure that you're really looking outside the box for what opportunities can emerge is an important part of what we do. Municipalities today, we deal in complexity. The world is getting more and more complex. And so we encourage you to go together, to go farther, so we can do things much more effectively. Okay, so when collaboration works, what needs to be in place? Well, generally, all parties need to want to be at the table. So what does that mean? Don't get me wrong. Doesn't necessarily mean everybody wants to be at every meeting, every moment, right? Fair. But every party that participates sees a potential benefit. They see the reason for being there. They've got skin in the game. There's a reason that they're going to emerge from the process better than they were before. And in fact, best off if what comes out of it is far better than what they could have ever done alone. So this can be done, though, not just in idealistic terms. Even when there's been challenging history, when people see that there's a benefit to working together, you can work through some of that history and build relationships so that you can still accomplish this. Okay, last one before we talk about drivers. We're going to move into some of the other pieces here. So drivers, it's really about being present. We're talking about people. We're talking about making sure that you're not going to change people. That's not the purpose here, but we're talking about how you work together throughout the process. It's not all or nothing either. This is a process. It's a journey. There's going to be times where things are going great, and there's going to be times where there are bumps in the road. So making sure that you really understand that it's an adaptive process, not just technically, but yes, absolutely. You set your goals, you understand what's going on, come up with options, come up with solutions, agree, and then monitor. But also think of that circular pattern as terms of the process. It's also not just linear. You may have to go back and say, oh, I thought I understood something, but you know what? I need to understand that a bit more. So you go back into it and understand a bit more. So those relationships build over time, and that success is incremental because you're gaining trust as you go. The result is that you have commitment. The people who are involved in that process, they are committed to the solutions that are agreed upon, and they are prepared to implement it.
Great. Do you want to just?
Yeah.
Thanks. Okay, so you have a general idea now of how we view collaboration, what it is, in terms of process and outcomes. Really, now the time is to assess whether, are you ready to work like that? Your organization, yourself, politicians, you name it. How ready are you to be collaborative in approach? Because as Stephanie just described, it's not really a start and a finish. It's more of a mindset. So internal, just like any other piece of strategy that I would do, quick assessment internally, externally. How ready are you? So external scan's pretty easy here. Local governments are being asked to do more with less, of course. Your stakeholders are more savvy and knowledgeable than ever. The complexity of the issues are only increasing, and expectations of, from the province to work more collaboratively are already there. So external, yes, probably some high motivation to figure out how to do more with less. Internal, Steph already touched on making sure that everybody at the table, all parties understand what the benefit of working collaboratively is. Is that there? Is it understood that what's been in place isn't working and you want to try something different, or you want to optimize what you're doing? So there's got to be some desire to try something different or do things slightly different. Is there a priority placed on this shift or change in mentality of how you work together? There's always lots going on at any given time, particularly with municipalities. Is the space there? Are internal resources available? So I'm talking staff, budget. Again, where does this fall in all of the other plans or initiatives that are going on? And actually, quite important is data. Do you have the information that you need to make good decisions? So yeah, you're deciding on how you want to make decisions, but do you have the information? And if you don't, what are you going to do with that? So this, I should say on this one, an honest assessment is pretty important here. So it's easy enough to just go through a checklist or to think that some areas are less important than others, but based on how we see collaboration being successful, are you ready to make some of those shifts or work a little bit differently? And if you're not, that's okay, but it's tough work to force when all those elements aren't in line. So let's say, yes, you are ready. There's just a few other high-level elements for consideration in order for collaboration to be successful. Commitment to a comprehensive framework. So understanding what the framework of the project that you are undertaking will be. What are you doing? It's good to see start to finish. How will this play out so there's no surprises? And that's the what you do, but it's also really important to go over the guiding principles of how you do it. So what does it look like when you come up with a decision to be made, or a conflict, or a tough choice, or when you know there's going to be instances of history? What, how are you going to work through the what you're working through? Approaching from trust, we're going to talk about that a little bit more throughout the program, so I'm not going to belabor it here, but trust is key. So not saying that it's always going to be there, but how will you build it? And can you build it? And what has to happen to build it? And then again, making sure once you've done that assessment, you know it's going to take a certain amount of time and resources and budget, making sure that's available, because this is a tough go to try to cut corners.
I'm just going to jump in on that one as well, that because things are different in terms of what we're planning, these elements are really important, particularly when it comes to collaboration frameworks, because now we're starting to talk about governance. We're talking about finance, cost sharing. We're talking about service delivery. And you have to address dispute resolution. So I'm going to say, likely there's going to be something that causes a bit of a trigger there. There might be something you have to uncover. They're not the easy conversations. So it's really important to make sure that you have clear line of sight in terms of what that process looks like, how we're going to work together.
Yeah, and I'll follow that up with, I can tell you, being somebody that works a lot with people in conflict, having proactive awareness and tools and processes in place to deal with conflict is always the way to go, as opposed to reactive. So again, it's just making sure you're smart in setting up what you're going to do and how you're going to do it, and having agreement on that process ahead of time. Okay, so I'm sure you can tell by now, it's really important that the parties that are involved in collaborative process are committed for sure and engaged in the process. So you have to be able through this process, and IDPs in particular, be able to assess opinions, options, look at implications of those options, provide objective feedback at any given time, and do it in a safe environment. So safe environment, open disclosure, where this is done in the room with all the parties present. So how many times have we seen, I personally have seen it a few, where some of this stuff can play out in the media or in other venues, which is detrimental to the process of collaboration. So it's really important that the people that are part of the process, dedicated to the process, they're engaged in the process, but they're able to say what they need to say when they have to say it, and they can work through it, knowing that that's actually what you're supposed to do here. It's not about hurting feelings or saying something that's going to anger someone, but that you do it in a way that feels good for everybody involved. Now, I do want to mention that active engagement or active participation can look different for other people. So I was at a meeting just a couple of weeks ago where there was lots of participants that were very vocal, and there was a handful that were very quiet. And I don't know, I can't assume why that is, but it takes a little bit of time and mindfulness to say, like, are these people not engaged, or are they not speaking because they don't want to, or they're not interested? But it just reminded me again when I had one of the quiet participants come up to me at the lunch break and just had such amazing insight. And in that instance, it just took a personal invite to share, right? So there's lots of ways that people need, I don't want to say permission, but there's lots of different ways that people will become involved, and we have to, as facilitators, adapt to them. But I will say it is easiest to be engaged when you know the rules of engagement. Okay, so a lot of the processes that we know now that we need time and space and commitment for these collaborative processes. but the processes that we're involved with can sometimes take a year, sometimes 2. That's a long time. So not only the process is a long time, but you get to implementation, and a lot of times you're just done, people are just done. But it's really important to figure out how do we sustain that momentum that's needed for collaborative process to be successful. So there's a few tips that'll show you that it's not being sustained or something's falling off the rails. Fragmented decision-making processes take place, so all of a sudden a decision is made and you don't know why. That time and resources that were dedicated at the beginning all of a sudden don't feel there anymore. Lack of organizational support, like just as much as political will and leadership. When that shifts, the process feels it for sure. And if there's citizen participation, you see it in them. All of a sudden, the social media or the comments back are not positive. So there's lots of different ways that you can sustain that effort, depending on who you're dealing with and the community that you're living in. But generally speaking, having a good process, so people understand what the process is from start to finish and can actually identify where they are at any given point, is key. Momentum forward, so actually moving from vision to action is important. So you can't stay on the vision, although very important, forever. You need to actually show in a tangible way you're moving forward. So you need to focus on the wins and celebrate those wins. Track your process in a tangible way as well, but also don't forget to check in a more informal way to see how people are doing. And then having consistent leadership, which is sometimes out of our hands, but it makes all the difference in the world in terms of somebody leading the program or process, or even the tone in a strong way. Okay, so this is where I want to turn it and open it to you a little bit. So it doesn't always happen. We're talking about collaboration pretty idealistically and in some ways romantically, I'm sure. But it's the conditions don't always exist for it to play out as we've just described. However, collaboration essentially is now being legislated. So in Section 3 of the MGA, it outlines the purpose of municipalities. And the amendments in 2017, it was amended to include collaboration as a defined purpose of a municipality. So there's, just very quickly, provide good government, provide services that are necessary for citizens, develop and maintain safe and viable communities. Then they added collaborate with neighboring municipalities and be stewards of the environment. So I think it would be hard to do a lot of those if you didn't deal with your neighbors closely and consistently. So I can tell you, going into clients and municipalities that have worked together closely, and those that maybe have a little bit more history, you can feel it when you walk in the room for sure. You know when there's some history of collaboration. And when I ask this question to the clients we're working with, how do you feel about mandated collaboration? Is that even a thing? How does that work? You can tell some are just like, we've done this. This isn't a stretch for us. It's just being a bit more mindful. And some you can say, well, we just got to do it, so we're just going to do it. Like there's an everything in between. So how do you feel about mandated collaboration? Is it a thing? Anyone? Yeah.
I don't know much about requirements, but I think maybe the province has felt that municipalities are lacking in this area, and that's why it triggers that they mandated it now. Because maybe they have seen that few municipalities are not working with each other well. But in our example, like in Ladue County and City of Edmonton annexation, at one time it was a confrontation, and it moved from confrontation to collaboration,
Yeah.
and the results were very great. So
Yeah. Right. So maybe it's something that you're saying communities could adapt to and see good results.
like Municipal Government Act, why their legislature did it, like why they did it. Many municipalities in Alberta are lacking in this area, and that's triggered them to make it mandated.
Yeah.
And second thing is that since we don't have like regional governments in place, every municipality is looking for their own independent freedom,
Yeah.
and they might see that there is a big value in working together because the objective is the same.
Yeah.
As you mentioned, Section 3 of the FTA, that the whole purpose of a municipality is to provide services to
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And so really, I think that that's with the mandated collaboration. It's to say you need to be, there's less money, there's more challenging problems, you need to be effective and efficient, so we are going to make it mandatory for you to collaborate. And it is a bit of just being a mediator and dealing with conflict resolution quite a bit, and people a lot. It does fascinate me a bit how that lands, because collaboration is something that is best done when people want to do it.
Portion of the MGA that fleshes out the, oh, that's loud. When you get to the portion of the MGA that fleshes out the mandated collaboration more,
Yep.
it's actually, if you don't get there, there's a process.
There is, yeah.
That's binding arbitration. If you
Yeah.
don't like the binding arbitration and the results, then you go back and you start collaborating again. So there is a feedback loop.
There definitely is a feedback loop, and you try to do it on your own. You do it, establish through plans like this. When things don't go right and you can't work it through, mediation, that doesn't work. Arbitration. I think it's the province's way, though, of saying we're just tired of dealing with very similar conflict. We don't want to tell you who the winner is anymore. You guys need to figure it out. So you, yeah, 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 yeah. Now they're saying, do it. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think as long as the legislative framework is interpreted in a way that allows for a certain degree of flexibility for different municipalities, that collaboration can be meaningful and constructive. As you know, we've found out through doing IDPs from rural to rural municipalities versus rural to urban, there's obviously a lot of differences in terms of the way that those plans and the ICFs will work. And I think there is enough flexibility in legislation, but obviously we'll see how that goes over the next couple of years.
Yeah, great. Anyone else? Yeah.
Hi. Yeah, I guess there's always a thought that mandated collaboration could be looked at as being insincere compared to voluntary collaboration.
Right.
So I just wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah.
I think
I
that
have lots of
I think
thoughts.
yeah, we have lots of comments on that.
That's like,
Depends on the situation.
maybe that's over a beer after this.
From our perspective, I think everything I've heard makes sense to me. I think for some municipalities and some relationships, a bit of a encouragement to say, yeah, take it a step forward. That leads to success in many cases. I think that for other municipalities, you might see the full gamut all the way up to arbitration and say, you know what, yeah, we didn't like that. That didn't work out for anybody particularly well. So we're going to start again. I do think that there's lots of opportunity for good collaboration to happen. I think a lot of the clients that I've talked to, lots of municipalities are saying, yeah, okay, when we go in, we always ask, what's the goal? What are you trying to achieve? Well, we have to. Okay, fine. So for a lot of municipalities, they're like, good, check, have to. We have to do that. However, there's all these things we've been wanting to do. And then we get into the meat of it. And then there's an opportunity, right?
Right, in a way it is good because you do have a process, a step-by-step process for it. But again, there is that, I think, that idea out there that because it is no longer voluntary, you think the people that are going into these collaboration discussions, they're more willing to come up with a more, I guess, sincere collaboration rather than a mandated collaboration.
Yeah,
You know.
I think that it's really, we have lots of thoughts on this, right? Which we can share later, because I'm interested in everybody's thoughts around this. But I just personally, as a practicing mediator and negotiator and somebody that does a lot of engagement and facilitation with lots of different groups, I think it's tough to have what I think your word was sincere or genuine collaboration without the willingness. And it's just a fine line. We see it more as, we know there's municipalities that don't want to be collaborative, but we just see it as an opportunity to introduce a few of those kernels. And it's baby steps, right? So maybe there'll be one thing that builds a little bit more trust, that opens the door to more collaboration down the line. It's not that the work can stop. It can't, but it's tough. It's a tough go from my perspective to do good collaborative work when you have people that don't want to.
We do have one here.
I look at mandated collaboration as a way to fix some of the damages that were done, especially when the old Regional Planning Commission was dissolved, and it left a huge gap. Now, we know urbans must expand, and they're going to continue to expand, but rural municipalities have more than enough land to expand into. And that's going to be a sort of friction between urbans and rurals. Unfortunately, when the Regional Planning Commission was dissolved, that was not even part of the conversation. If you want municipalities to be able to sustain or maintain good government within their own areas and actually be able to make the community healthy, there are a number of things that needed to be done. And because people get positional when it comes to the issue of land. And you're taking my land. It doesn't matter whether, you don't own any land. People own the land, but you just have jurisdiction. Nobody cares. It's just our land, and you are taking our land. And that's always a source of friction. So that's why when I look at this issue of collaboration between municipalities, it's going to be, if it's not enforced, it's not going to work. Because no matter what you do, you were talking about a number of things in terms of, one, there has to be a win-win in this. Somebody, you're not going there to lose something. You want to win something out of it. Unfortunately, the person or the municipality you are having a conversation with, they are dug in. They don't want to give an inch. And when you have that kind of win-lose confrontation between a win-win, somebody who's going in there, then it becomes a major challenge. So I think it's a balancing act.
That's great.
Some areas, especially in services, you can collaborate, but when it comes to the issue of land, sometimes you have to mandate it.
Yep. Yes, I agree. Good. Anyone else? Oh, one more.
Thank you. Just to add to the gentleman's comments about RPCs, I was part of RPCs back in the 80s, and I came to Alberta because there was a new planning act that said you had to have a regional plan done by a certain date, and it had to be within an RPC. So that's why we got the 10 regional plans and 10 RPCs. This is almost like history repeating itself. And it's really interesting how this government has put this in place. I'm still learning about some of the latest because I've been doing other kind of planning work. So yeah, I think this is really, really interesting, politically and collaboratively for municipalities. There's been too many headaches. There's been too many issues, too many investigations. And it's about time that things start to get right.
Yeah. Yes, we find it interesting as well. That's good. Okay. Moving on. So I won't stay on this slide too long. I'm sure you all know the signs of not being ready, but it's pretty clear when you see conversations that have a demanding or bullying tone in nature that there's probably a bit of a twig for us to say, okay, there's a bit of a switch that would need to happen here in order to move forward collaboratively. Positional thinking is another one of those, right? You just mentioned that too, right? That positional, entrenched, I am not moving until I get my way. That's tough. That's a tough one. Okay, so trust. We've talked about trust a lot, or referred to it a lot, but haven't gone into any detail on it. Trust does need to be present for collaborative process to take place. It's a bit circular, and I also talk about that, and I'd probably open that up to you as well, but we've just had good conversation. Do you need trust in order to start the collaborative process, or can you use the collaborative process to build trust? right? It's probably the latter when some of these processes are indeed mandated. It's looking for ways to build trust in some instances if it's not there. So, suspicion and poor behaviors based on past negative experiences must be overcome to some degree in order to move forward. And thankfully, the trust is behavior-based, so it's built and lost based on individual experiences, which is good because that means it can be indeed rebuilt. So, tips for rebuilding trust. Addressing the concerns that are there, usually quite helpful. Talking them through in terms of what the past issues were. Identify what the triggers were in previous experience that still may have a hangover. If there is suspicion in the process, don't just push through it. Actually, pause the process when need be and explore why that suspicion is there. And so, if you can't do that yourself, there's always third parties to help through these processes. As we know now, through the MGA, there's pretty clear mechanisms for how to resolve disputes, what the steps for that are involved, but go, use somebody, a mediator. No problem, especially if it's tense.
Yeah, certain examples of this has been really helpful in my practice. When I worked in the city of Calgary, we had lots of conversations, lots of collaborations that were happening with industry and with nonprofits and whatnot. And we would come to situations where we're working in a big group, 20 people working through something. Clearly, there's an issue that 2 or 3 parties aren't really prepared to talk about in front of everybody else, but it's stopping the process. Yeah. And so saying to everyone, hey, you know what? We recognize that there's something going on, but it's not everybody's thing. So if it's okay with you, we take another outside meeting. And I have sat down, and not necessarily actually mediated, just sat down with 4 people, 2 who are a little bit more invested in the concern, and 2 who are a little bit more neutral, and just had a really honest conversation around what's going on, what's it causing, understanding it. Not to say that we necessarily got to back up to full level of trust, because this was a very contentious issue. However, that conversation enabled those 2 individuals to understand, come to resolution on one item that went into a report. But it enabled them to move forward and continue on with the rest of the process and let the rest of the 20 continue on as well. So I have to say this is one of the most successful things that I've been able to use in my practice, because you can take a moment, and if you don't, that issue doesn't go away. It festers.
Yeah, and I would agree. So I do, and I will say, in the municipal setting, this can be tough because there is changeover of not only politicians, but of staff, and there is sometimes a resistance to open up that can of worm. Again, that was so horrific, we don't want to go back there. But sometimes, I would say in my experience, mostly, if you don't, it's hard to move forward. And so it's just finding that balance. What's the right amount of going back and opening it to set yourself up for success?
Okay, so now we've talked a lot about what successful collaboration looks like and what to be aware of when it's not necessarily going the way you want. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the collaborative approaches that Lauren and I and our teams have used when it comes to collaboration. So particularly around intermunicipal work. So first, when you start with the process, start with yourself, start with your own municipality. Really assess your commitment to the process and why you are, but then also figure out what you want out of it. What do you need out of it, and what are you prepared to offer? We want to make sure that you have a really good inventory of what you need to get out of the entire planning process. You may not know everything at that early stage of the project, but start to understand what you need. Because I do find in these processes, sometimes the hardest thing, more so when it's personal than when it's in a municipal setting, but sometimes the hardest thing to know is what you need out of it. And so making sure you understand that, making sure you have the data and the reports and all of the background information that you need to come to an informed decision. So the other piece, pull from your past projects. Many of us have done tremendous work over the years, so pull from that work. Pull from the citizen engagement work that you've done also, so that you're not reinventing things. You may need to test those things, but you don't necessarily just need to start from scratch. We've talked a fair bit about this in terms of you starting the collaboration. It's an critical stage of collaboration. And so it's important to keep in mind that you should focus on building the process together. Even before you say start the official planning process, like if you're doing an IDP, get a steering committee together between the two municipalities so that you can sit down and say, okay, what's important to us? What are we trying to accomplish? How are we going to do it? Because I can tell you great work has been done across the province in terms of setting up toolkits and case studies and all of that stuff. That material is fantastic. And every situation is unique, and you need to be able to respond to that unique situation. So build it together. And then also make sure that you're bringing in the right people at the right time. So I know that we've got 2 years for a lot of these plans. That's a very short period of time for the vastness of some of these plans that some of you have to do. However, it will go much more smoothly if you've got the time set aside for it in the right priority setting. And so make sure everyone's there and make sure the decision makers are involved, because they need to understand the process along the way. One of the processes that I worked with a long time ago in collaboration changed quite dramatically. A plan was implemented and the partners were at the table to actually do the implementation, but their priorities slipped. And so it became less of a priority. And so we had a lot of very interested citizens step up into that group. They didn't have the decision-making authority to implement that plan. And so it became kind of this cycle where they weren't able to get anywhere because they didn't have the decision makers in the room. So very important to make sure you've got the right people at the right time. The next one that we would highly recommend is a project chartering process. This is something we use with a lot of our projects. Many municipalities will be doing this internally, but it's great to do at the beginning of a project, because if you invest, say, 4 hours with the municipalities, whatever municipalities are involved, whether it's 2 or 6 or 9 or whatever it may be, you take a few minutes, half a day, maybe a day if you're dealing with a really complex one, and you talk about what are the objectives. Let's be clear around what are the measures of success at the end of the day. Let's make sure that we talk about how we're going to engage and how we're going to communicate throughout the process. Talk about risks and mitigations, because risks come up. It's how you deal with them. That's the most important thing. And also roles and responsibilities. I can't tell you the number of times that people think they understand how the roles are going to go, but they haven't had a conversation around it. So making sure you just spend some time talking about it gets everyone on the same page. But it also enables people to take a few minutes to talk about what's important to them in the plan. And more information starts to unfold. You start to understand much more about why everyone's at the table. And so that process is a coming together, and it is a relationship builder process, but it's also very informational and helps drive the success of a plan. Okay, something else that we use. This is based on some work by, called The Power of Co by a researcher in Australia, and we quite like this work because we have so far in this session talked a lot about relationships and trust building, but developing inter-municipal development plans or any municipal type plans also requires strong knowledge-based decisions. There are technical decisions that need to be made in all of those pieces. And so these plans are not just agreements based on what people believe. They are supported throughout each phase by the technical, the legislative requirements, whatever information needs to be brought to the table to make an informed decision. And the reason this is so important is that we are not able to test our true outcomes unless we get into the details. The details, the rubber hits the road type details, are where we test whether or not we're actually achieving our goals. And so it's this lovely balancing of saying we wanted to achieve this and here are the details of it. Did we get there? All right, and the last one, consensus. I tend to call this one a bit of an elephant in the room because, yes, many of our municipalities want to work with a consensus process. It is a very collaborative approach. There are many different ways to do it. But we also have to realize that whatever recommendations come forward in terms of a plan, they need to be adopted by both councils or multiple councils to actually be adopted. And so keep that in mind as you go all the way through. Whether you choose a voting process or a consensus type process, you need to be aware that you need to build that buy-in and that support all the way along so that you get a majority vote out of all councils. The other thing I want to talk about is there's a lot of misconception around consensus. It does not necessarily take a lot of time to build consent on everything. Consensus isn't about agreeing on every detail. It really is about making sure that every party gets what they need out of the plan What I might need from that plan is different than what you might need for that. But together, it makes for an excellent plan together. And generally, my test is that every party can live with the plan and test it further. Not just live with it. Can you actively support implementing that plan? That's the test of whether or not you've got consensus.
Great. So I want to just spend a little bit of time. I'm going to go just a touch micro here. And I want to make it clear that usually everything we're going over in the next not even 5 minutes is something I could probably spend an hour or two on just any given topic. So I'm not by any stretch trying to teach you how to be a mediator or a negotiator, but I just want you to be aware of some of the skills that contribute to collaborative process, because it doesn't happen easily on its own. And if you're a part of the process, it can take just such a small amount of effort to switch the tone from more top-down to collaborative. So first off, for me, it's really important, I think, for us to all understand where and how we deal with conflict. So how you contribute to a situation that has conflict in it, how you handle it, how you interact with others. So if you look at this spectrum, I would say, generally speaking, collaborative, which makes sense now that you know me a little bit more, my background and training, but I'm not always collaborative. So a good example for me is when I'm talking with my children, who are 8 and 9, and very much like their mother, they always have a plan, and they're always trying to negotiate a deal. And so there's times when I probably fall on every one of those bubbles. So there's times when I actually don't think it's a negotiation, even though that they do, and there will be a loser and a winner. And I guarantee I'm not the loser. And then there's times when I am exhausted by them, and I accommodate, roll over, and give them their way. No problem, because I don't want to deal with it. And so generally, that's my style, collaborate, but I have probably did a little bit of everything. So just do you know generally what your main style is when you look at that spectrum? Yeah? Okay. Just quickly, not that there's no judgment, this is a safe environment. Who would say that they're more of the conflict adverse, which is the lose-lose? Really just don't like conflict. Wow. How about the win-lose? So that's more of the bullying technique. Oh, gee, okay, good. And then the compromise, where you kind of go in and you say, yeah, there you go. I'll win some, right, okay, good. And then is there, this is more the absolute conflict adverse, is where they just, I'm not dealing with this, just do whatever you want, just make this go away. And then collaborative. So we had a few in that one. Okay, so in this room, probably because we have like profession and projects
you came
that
to
we
this
work
session.
on. Yeah, we came to the session. But quite typically, it's across the board. And I think it's just important for us to realize that we set up these processes, and I'm certainly collaborative in nature, and I set up collaborative process, but the way that people take this experience in and can have output or contribute to the experience is different. And so we just need to be mindful of that. How do we deal with conflict? Which I don't want to say conflict's a bad thing. Generally, if you can work through it, you get to a much better place. But what are your tendencies? So that's step one for me. How do you deal with conflict? And then being aware that others deal with things differently. Okay, and then I want to touch a little bit on positions versus interests. So this gentleman touched on positions. And it's very positional negotiations or processes is very entrenched. It's bottom line. This is my bottom line, and there's nothing you can say to get me off of it. And if there's two or multiple parties of that mindset, you can imagine negotiating is not that much fun. It's very confrontational. If you can set up a process or be a person that's much more interested in why that person has that position, much easier to have the process unfold. So I am very much more interested in why something is, but even more so, what's the motivator behind it? The hopes, the beliefs, the fears, the concerns. That's what I try to get get past positional process. And then I want to show you this quickly. Has anybody seen this? It's not about the nail. I love this one. It's just a really very exaggerated scenario of what happens when you're too focused on a solution without understanding what the issue is.
It's just, there's all this pressure, you know? And sometimes it feels like it's right up on me, and I can just feel it, like literally feel it in my head, and it's relentless. And I don't know if it's gonna stop. I mean, that's the thing that scares me the most, is that I don't know if it's ever gonna stop.
Yeah. Well, you do have a nail in your head.
It is not about the nail.
Are you sure? Because, I mean, I'll bet if we got that out of there...
Stop trying to fix it.
No, I'm not trying to fix it. I'm just pointing out that maybe the nail is causing...
You always do this. You always try to fix things when what I really need is for you to just listen.
See, I don't think that is what you need. I think what you need is to get the nail
See,
out.
you're not even listening now.
Okay, fine. I will listen. Fine.
It's just, sometimes it's like, there's this achy, I don't know what it is. And I'm not sleeping very well at all. And all my sweaters are snagged. I mean, all of them.
That sounds really hard.
It is. Thank you. Ow!
Oh, come on. If you would just...
Don't.
Try to see things my way. Do I have to keep...
Right. So, yes, very exaggerated, but it's trying to get to the point we're making. It's tough to just drop the solution so quickly without understanding actually what's going on for that person, and it doesn't proceed very nicely. It doesn't take the process to a place where it would need to go. Okay, oh, sorry, I'll just put it back on the skills. So some ways to get better understanding so you don't have this situation happen. Active listening, which is such a lost art form these days, right? So computers and whatever else, your phone, it's just something that's, I think, gone. And it's not just listening to hear what's being understood, but it's listening to understand what's being said. So there's a bit of a difference. Actually getting off our electronics and being present. Empathy is not something that, and it's often misconstrued as agreeing with what somebody's saying, but it's not agreeing, it's just in the moment, walking in someone else's shoes. So understanding something might be difficult is not agreeing or validating what that thing was, that it was right or wrong. It's just like, yeah, oh, geez, that must be tough. Like just having a moment where it's human, very human. Probing questions, so I'll talk about it in a minute, but it's really to get past that position, what do you need to do for understanding? Like you just can't ask closed-ended questions all the time. So it's the whys, the whats, and the wheres. A reframe, I deal with a lot of people that could be perceived as negative, and often it's because they don't feel heard. And so a reframe is a very powerful tool to take something that sounds negative, but switches it around to get them focused on actually what they want, not just what's annoying. And so that's a more nuanced skill, but very powerful. Paraphrasing and summarizing. So in this process, particularly with IDPs, ICFs, there's always a lot of information that just sort of feels like it's overwhelming. For me, in my practice, it's very important that you spend the time to make sure that you captured it by paraphrasing, make sure that everybody understood what was said, and doing that by effective summaries is pretty productive. Confrontation and immediacy, I'll get into that in a little bit. Normalizing, I'll also get into that. And then the refocus. So that's something, too, I'm very mindful of doing. These cover a lot of elements and aspects to the planning process. And really, what are you, at any given moment, what are you there to discuss? And there's nothing wrong with just sort of saying, whoa, that's a totally different issue. We're here to discuss this now, but we'll discuss that later, parking it. Okay, so just very quickly, getting from that position to the interest, it's most what we hear in one little snippet or position base statement is like this, and you really want to get here for understanding, for true understanding of the interests, of the why. And so it's asking those questions, not closed-ended, yes or no, because people will say yes or no if you give them the option, but it's really going deep. So why was that important? Oh, I heard that. Can you tell me more about that? What do I need to know here? Just keep going down and down and down. So these are challenging skills, for sure, for a lot of planners, for sure, because they're mistaken with being confrontational when they're not. We don't want to start a fight, and we don't want to hurt people's feelings, and then even as consultants, you often need to know the answer, but calling something to attention that can be helpful in the moment so it doesn't fester or grow into a bigger issue down the road is really important for this type of work. So if you hear mixed messaging or something's contrary, bringing it up in the moment in a very non-confrontational way is helpful. I just heard this, but 10 minutes ago, I think you said that. Just want to make sure I heard it right, or maybe you could clarify what you meant. Just anything that you can do to create awareness in a very non-judgmental way. And then normalizing, some of these things are tough, but we have to go through them in order to get to the other side. And there's nothing wrong with us as facilitators or participants saying, you look emotional, that's okay. This can be emotional, and this is tough. And again, that's okay. Conflict is normal. And then immediacy is more just when you find processes being disrupted. When I mediate, I often have lawyers in the room, and you'll get a lot of like pen, eye rolling. Nothing wrong with just sort of saying, I'm finding that very distracting, and I'm sure the other participants are. Just, again, it's not because you're trying to be bossy or start a fight. It's because you're protecting your process, and it's in the best interest of the process and the people that are involved. Okay, so very quickly, potential barriers. Just things to be aware of. When you yourself are part of and facilitating a collaborative process, group size, 4 versus 40, which I've had both, very different process, very different prep. Just be prepared. Emotion, that's a tough one, and I'm not going to be able to get into it right now. We don't have enough time, but it's something that as a mediator I've become very comfortable with. Emotion doesn't mean something should shut down. It's a key or a clue to something there, except for when it's not and it's being used as manipulation and railroading. So it's one of those ones that takes a lot more time and understanding on how to work through. But emotion isn't something I'm ever scared of, but it is quite intuitive as to what it's about. And so just know that if you have a trigger reaction, why is that for you, first of all, but do you need to sit with it a little bit longer? Position and power, it's tough when you have process and you have, say, the CEO and people that are not in a position to make decisions. And how do you even out a process? Just something to be aware of. Gender, very high level. Women and men tend to negotiate differently, so be aware of those dynamics. And then experience. Who's in the room? How much experience do they have in negotiating? And how does the process reflect that? What do you do to, again, equalize the imbalance? So those are just a few quick and dirty skills that are very useful for helping out in successful collaborative process. Happy to talk about it more later.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots to that, of course, and practice makes the most impact of it. But they're all skills we use every day, actually, not just in this situation, but those are skills that help us through every conversation that we're having. Now, we have talked a lot about the process and the skills, because those are things that we tend not to talk about in the planning world. One of the things I did want to touch on is that success really hinges not just on the process, but in terms of getting results. People are motivated to participate in these kind of processes when they're getting there. But I'm not going to promise any type of distinct results coming out of it. The owners of the results are the participants and the decision makers in the process. So keep that in mind. But it is super important to recognize that all of this work, all collaborations, are aiming at achieving outcomes and results. And people lose motivation when we're not moving towards that. You'll also sense success when you start to see people feeling empowered. How do you know that you're getting success? Well, you should be monitoring and evaluating throughout the process, as well as you start into implementation. It's critical. You also need to communicate, and it says successes, but actually you need to communicate your progress, your successes and your challenges. And if you have challenges, talk about how you're going to address them. That's what keeps citizens from feeling like they don't know what's going on. So quick summary. Successful collaborations, well, they take a lot of effort, but generally it takes honesty, it takes looking out for each other, it takes having open communication, both the positive and the areas that you're concerned about. You need to include those decision makers, and you have to have an open mind and look for possibilities at all times. It generally results in great outcomes for all. Inclusive outcomes, ones that mean that the parties who are at the table feel like their interests have been met, and also that there's a shared sense of responsibility and decision-making for that implementation, because at the end of the day, it's not just a plan, it's about the implementation. So we've talked about lots of examples today, lots of skills. There is tremendous amount of wealth of experience in the province in terms of how to do collaborations, and I highly encourage you to reach out to your peers in other municipalities to understand what has worked and what has been the challenge for them. And so with that, if we have time for any questions, that would be great.
Thank you very much. You know what? I think we should give a round of applause for Lauren and Steph for that.
Thank you.
Very timely. Thank you so much. We are coming up to 4:30. Let's have one quick question. Is there a burning question from the group that that you want to ask Steph and Lauren? Ganesh?
I just have one really burning question in the sense, I guess I have always found that between rural and urban municipalities, there are like lots of like issues. But based on your previous work, like between rural to rural, along those boundaries, what are the key issues that you found, like would really be helpful to understand the kind of like solutions we're looking for along those boundaries?
That might be more of a one-on-one conversation to talk about your specific situation, because even rural to rural, there's so many different dynamics that are going on in terms of what the municipalities want, what the stakeholders want in that area. I think we can talk one-on-one though, because there is a lot of difference between the rural municipalities, and every situation really is unique. So I think I would be remiss in giving you an answer to it.
Seeing nothing else right now, are you both available for questions after?
Yeah.
Offline? Perfect. Again, let's give Lauren and Steph a round of applause, and thank you so much on this very timely issue. And on behalf of APPI, thank you so much.
Thank you.